I really want you to just picture the scene for a second. It is July 5th, 2011.
Oh, man, that day.
Right. Millions of people across the country, maybe even you listening to this right now, are just glued to their television screens, or they're, obsessively refreshing their browsers.
The internet was basically melting down.
It really was. The architecture of major news networks was practically buckling under the traffic. CNN's web traffic surged to 30 times its normal average.
Which is just an astronomical number.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And outside this courthouse in Orlando, Florida, there's a massive crowd, over 500 people baking in the brutal summer heat.
Just waiting.
Waiting for a conclusion to a story that had totally consumed their lives for 3 whole years. And then the verdict comes down.
Yeah.
Caylee Anthony is found not guilty of murdering her 2-year-old daughter, Caylee.
And the crowd just loses it.
In that instant, they erupt in absolute unrestrained anger. It was this cultural shockwave that it just seemed to defy the reality everyone thought they'd been watching.
It was a moment that fundamentally stopped the entire country in its tracks. I mean, without a doubt.
Yeah.
The public reaction wasn't just, surprise. It was this visceral, palpable outrage.
People were furious.
Because they genuinely felt they had watched a murder trial unfold in real time, night after night, on cable television.
Right, Nancy Grace screaming every night.
Exactly. So the ending they were given just completely shattered their expectations of how the American justice system is supposed to function, when a child loses her life.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the reverberations of that single verdict are still dictating how we view criminal trials today.
Absolutely there.
For this deep dive, we are taking on the Caylee Anthony trial. And to truly understand how that jury reached a not guilty verdict, we really have to look past the cable news shouting matches.
We have to look at the actual source material.
Right. I've been poring over the raw materials we have. We've got the completely flawed digital forensic logs of the Anthony family computer, the prosecution's full trial transcripts, and some incredibly revealing PBS frontline interviews with the lead trial lawyers on both sides.
The frontline interviews are fascinating.
They really are. So our mission today is to examine the highly controversial forensic science, the brilliant and frankly shocking defense strategy, and the critical digital discrepancies.
All the stuff that led to a verdict that still deeply divides the nation.
Yeah, which is honestly the only intellectually honest way to do it.
Right. Because when you strip away the talking heads, the tabloid sensationalism and those relentless cable news chyrons, what you're left with is a terrifyingly complex puzzle.
A puzzle of purely circumstantial evidence.
Exactly. To understand the jury's perspective, you have to understand the specific mechanics of how the prosecution attempted to build their puzzle piece by piece.
And how the defense systematically dismantled it. So to see that puzzle clearly, we have to start with the timeline.
The timeline is everything.
The state's entire case, their narrative of a cold, calculated first-degree murder was built on a staggering 31-day timeline of deception.
Let's lay out the groundwork for that.
Let's do it. June 16th, 2008. Caylee Anthony is living with her parents, George and Cindy Anthony, in a quiet Orlando neighborhood.
Right, with her 2-year-old daughter, Caylee.
Yes. George is a former police detective who took a job in security, and Cindy is a registered nurse manager. And by all accounts in the sources, Caylee is the absolute center of their universe.
They doted on her.
Completely. They have a backyard playhouse built just for her. Her room is famously covered in all these Winnie the Pooh decorations.
It was a very involved grandparent situation.
It was. So on this specific day, George watches his 22-year-old daughter, Caylee, leave the house at 12:50 in the afternoon.
And Caylee is with her.
Caylee is with her. George notes she's wearing a pink shirt, jean shorts, sunglasses, and a little backpack. He gives his granddaughter a kiss goodbye.
And that is it.
That is the absolute last time anyone other than Caylee ever sees Caylee alive.
Wow. And that moment kicks off what the prosecution meticulously framed as a 31-day illusion.
Yeah, illusion is the perfect word for it.
Because from that exact afternoon onward, Caylee Anthony just begins spinning an incredibly elaborate, deeply layered web of lies. She has to explain the physical absence of her daughter.
And she doesn't just, offer a quick excuse. She constructs an entire alternate reality.
Right. I want to look closely at the architecture of those lies, because the sheer volume of detail is staggering.
It's totally baffling. So when her mother, Cindy, starts asking why she can't see her granddaughter, Caylee claims she's in Tampa for a work conference at Busch Gardens.
Right. She says Caylee is safely with a nanny.
Yes. A woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. Caylee affectionately refers to her as Zanny.
The Zanny, the nanny.
Exactly. And when Cindy presses harder over the coming weeks, the story expands, almost like a mutating virus.
It just keeps growing.
Caylee claims she's leaving Caylee with all these fabricated friends. She gives them names, backgrounds: Juliet, Annabelle, a guy named Jeffrey Hopkins.
She even gave them backstories.
Yeah. At one point, she claims Zanny the nanny was in a car accident on the interstate and was hospitalized. And Caylee tells her mom she's tending to the nanny while Caylee is with these fake friends at a resort hotel.
What's fascinating here is the psychological endurance required to maintain that level of fabrication.
I can't even imagine.
I mean, she is creating a fictional universe and populating it with characters, all while dodging frantic phone calls and text messages from her mother.
A mother who just wants to hear her granddaughter's voice.
Right. Casey's own brother, Lee, is eventually dispatched to go look for her at downtown Orlando nightclubs.
Yeah.
It was just a masterclass in avoidance.
But the juxtaposition of her lies against her actual whereabouts is what makes this so incredibly haunting to me.
Because the state was tracking her.
Exactly. Yeah. The state was simultaneously tracking her actual movements through her cell phone pings and surveillance footage.
So where is Caylee while she's telling her mom she's working in Tampa?
She's casually shopping at a JCPenney. She's wandering the aisles at Target.
Oh my God.
She's renting movies at Blockbuster with her new boyfriend, this guy named Tony Lazzaro.
Just living a completely normal, carefree life.
Completely. Her car runs out of gas at one point, and instead of calling for help, she just abandons it in the parking lot of an Amscott financial store next to a dumpster.
And then there's the nightclub photos.
Most infamously, yeah. 4 days after Caylee was last seen, Caylee is photographed at a nightclub called Fusion, smiling brilliantly and entering a hot body contest.
That visual, a mother partying while her child is missing, that became the emotional core of the public's outrage.
Oh, absolutely. It's what made everyone hate her.
And it eventually forced the collapse of her timeline. The catalyst for that collapse happened on July 15th, 2008.
Right. The abandoned car.
Yeah, Caylee's abandoned car had been towed from that Amscott parking lot.
Mm-hmm.
A letter was sent to the registered owners, who were George and Cindy.
And when Cindy discovers the car was abandoned locally, she realizes Caylee has been absolutely lying about being in Tampa for a month.
So Cindy's reaction is explosive. She goes to the tow yard, and we're going to dive deeply into the terrifying condition of that car in a little bit. But she pulls a notebook out of the front seat.
A notebook belonging to one of Caylee's friends, Amy Huizenga.
Right. Cindy has never even met this girl, but she uses the notebook to track Amy down at the Florida Mall.
She is playing detective.
She gets Amy in her car, drives straight to Tony Lazzaro's apartment, marches right up to the door, and physically pulls Caylee out of the apartment.
And of course, Caylee isn't there.
At this point, the reality is undeniable. Cindy drives Caylee to the police station and calls 911.
Those 911 calls are chilling.
In those now infamous hysterical calls, Cindy tells the dispatchers her granddaughter has been missing for a month. She says she's been kidnapped by a nanny.
And she includes one detail that changes the entire trajectory of the case. She says Caylee's car smells like a dead body.
Yes, that specific phrase.
I look at Caylee's pathological lying during this specific window, not as a cliche Jenga tower that eventually falls, but more like a frantic software patch.
Oh, that's a really good analogy.
Right. Imagine you're writing code for a program and a critical error pops up. Your mother wants to see the child. You write a hasty, chaotic patch. She's with a nanny in Tampa.
But that patch creates a new bug.
Exactly. The bug is, let me talk to the nanny. So you write another patch. The nanny was in a car crash.
Every single day, she is writing chaotic new code just to keep the program running for 24 more hours.
Regardless of how bloated and unstable the entire system is getting.
Yeah.
And when Cindy finally unplugs the machine on July 15th, Caylee doesn't confess. She just boots up a totally different, equally fake operating system for the police. The kidnapping narrative.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanism of her deception, because she actively led detectives on a wild goose chase that literally defied logic.
She physically escorted police officers to the Sawgrass apartments.
Yes. She pointed to a specific front door and stated, "That is where I dropped my daughter off with the nanny."
And the police immediately checked the lease records, right?
They did. The apartment had been completely vacant for over 140 days.
I mean, she takes it even further. She tells detectives she works as an event coordinator at Universal Studios and that she lost her fun there.
So the detectives literally drive her to Universal Studios.
Right, she walks purposefully past the security booth, marches down an administration hallway, reaches a dead end, turns around with her hands in her pockets, and just smiles at the cops.
She just says, I don't work here.
She hadn't worked there in years. It's wild. So I have to ask you, looking at this legally, if you are a prosecutor, how do you translate this bizarre pathological lying into a conviction for first-degree murder?
Especially when you don't possess a murder weapon, a confession, or direct proof of a homicide.
Exactly. How do you do it?
Well, you rely on a foundational legal and psychological concept known as mens rea, or the guilty mind.
The guilty mind.
Yeah. Prosecutors Linda Drain Burdick and Jeff Ashton looked at those 31 days and built their entire narrative around the mechanics of human behavior.
Okay.
They argued a premise that resonates deeply with any jury. Innocent people grieve. When a child goes missing, an innocent parent panics.
They call the police immediately. They scream for help.
Right. Guilty people, on the other hand, employ the exact software patches you describe. They run, they lie, they divert attention.
They go to nightclubs to simulate normalcy.
Exactly. So the behavioral evidence basically becomes a substitute for the smoking gun.
In a narrative sense, yeah.
The prosecution is asking the jury a behavioral question. Does this look like a mother desperately searching for a kidnapped child?
Yeah.
Or does this look like a mother who has purposely freed herself of a burden to enjoy the good life?
But this strategy represents a massive, almost unprecedented gamble in a capital murder trial, right?
A huge gamble.
I want to build on that. Why is it such a gamble? Because to the public, those lies are the absolute proof of her guilt. She lied to the police, she lied to her family, she partied.
It seems obvious to the public. But legally, being a pathological liar does not prove you're a murderer. It relies almost entirely on character evidence.
Okay, that makes sense.
You are asking a jury to convict a 22-year-old woman of capital murder, a crime that carried the death penalty in Florida, mind you, not because you can explicitly prove how she killed the child.
But because her behavior suggests she is the kind of person who would kill her child.
Exactly. You're demanding the jury make a massive inferential leap. And while it's incredibly powerful for storytelling, in a strict court of law, behavioral evidence alone leaves the door wide open for reasonable doubt.
So the prosecution knew they couldn't just rely on those 31 days of lies.
No, they desperately needed physical evidence to anchor the behavioral evidence.
And that search for a physical anchor leads us straight to one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in modern trial history. Casey's white Pontiac Sunfire.
The famous weight car.
Yes, the entire forensic investigation begins with that abandoned vehicle. Let's look closely at the day it was recovered. When the car was towed from the Amscott parking lot, it ended up at Johnson's Wrecker Service. George Anthony goes to the tow yard to pick it up on July 15th.
Right.
He's walking out to the lot with the tow yard manager, a man named Simon Birch. Now, Simon Birch has been in the towing business for decades.
The source materials note he has encountered every conceivable situation.
Yeah, including cars where people have, committed suicide and sat in the Florida heat for days. He knows exactly what the chemical breakdown of a human body smells like.
It is a scent that is entirely distinct from spoiled food or typical garbage.
Exactly the point Birch made. As they approach the Sunfire, this absolutely overwhelming, suffocating smell hits them. It's emanating directly from the trunk.
I can't even imagine that moment for George.
George Anthony actually later testified that he literally said a silent prayer before they opened it, terrified he was going to find his daughter or his granddaughter inside.
Wow.
But when they popped the trunk, there is no body. There is only a small bag of household garbage.
Just trash.
Right. But Simon Birch is so physically repulsed by the odor that he throws the garbage bag over the fence into a nearby dumpster.
He just tosses it.
Yeah. Then George drives the car home, pulls it into the garage, and when Cindy opens the interior door to the garage, her immediate visceral reaction is, Jesus, what died?
And that specific smell is what shatters her denial and prompts those frantic 911 calls.
Exactly. So the physical investigation immediately starts with this powerful clue, the smell of death.
However, in a court of law, a bad smell is highly subjective. A defense attorney will simply argue it was a bag of rotting trash left in a hot car.
Which Baez did.
Right. You can't just have a tow truck driver take the stand and say it smelled really bad. You have to quantify it. You must prove it scientifically to a jury.
And the first step in that scientific validation involves the cadaver dogs.
The canine units.
Right. The Orange County Sheriff's Office brings in a highly specialized canine named Jairus, handled by Deputy Jason Forgay.
And to understand how crucial this is, we have to look at the chemistry of how these dogs operate. They aren't just smelling bad things.
No, not at all.
When human tissue breaks down, bacteria produce very specific diamine gases, specifically putrescine and cadaverine.
Those are essentially the molecular signature of rotting flesh.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A trained cadaver dog ignores spoiled food or dead animals. They are looking for parts per trillion traces of these specific human decomposition gases.
So they walk Jerus around the exterior of the Sunfire, and the dog gives a trained final alert right on the truck.
And then they bring in a second dog from a neighboring county, and that dog alerts to the scent of human decomposition near the playhouse in the Anthony family's backyard.
Which is horrifying, but the canine alerts just provide probable cause,
Yeah.
right? Dogs cannot take the witness stand.
Right. To truly attempt to lock this down for a jury, to move from subjective scent to objective data, the prosecution ventured into territory where criminal courts rarely go.
They sought out an expert on the intricate biochemistry of human decomposition. They called Dr. Arpad Vass from the renowned Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee.
Yes, Dr. Vass had dedicated over 20 years to studying human decomposition. His life's work at the Body Farm facility was attempting to isolate the exact chemical signature, the precise molecular compounds that create the odor of a decomposing human body.
So the state sent his laboratory air samples taken directly from the trunk of the Sunfire, along with pieces of the stained spare tire cover found inside.
And I want to emphasize how groundbreaking this moment was in the trial. It was the very first time odor analysis of this nature had ever been admitted into a U.S. criminal court.
The judge allowing it was a massive victory for the state.
Huge. So Dr. Vaz takes the stand, and he doesn't just confirm the canine alerts. He testifies that when he opened the sealed evidence containing the tire cover, he recognized the unmistakable odor of human decomposition.
But he takes the science much further than just smelling it.
He does. He analyzes the compounds using a mass spectrometer and testifies that out of all the chemicals present, he found an astonishingly high concentration of one specific substance.
Chloroform.
Chloroform, a chemical compound historically famous for its use as an anesthetic to incapacitate people.
Like in the old movies.
Exactly. Dr. Voss testified that while microscopic baseline amounts of chloroform can theoretically be produced naturally during the biological breakdown of a body, the levels found in the air samples from Casey's trunk were exponentially like thousands of times greater than normal human decomposition.
So the prosecution used this data to imply a completely horrifying narrative, that Casey didn't just transport a dead body in her trunk.
Right. She actively used chloroform to incapacitate her 2-year-old daughter before killing her.
But the defense lead attorney, Jose Bess, recognized immediately that if the jury believed this science, the trial was over. Period.
Oh, absolutely. So he launches a devastating counterattack on Dr. Voss's credibility.
Baez systematically deconstructs the testimony and coins a phrase that would completely define the defense's strategy: fantasy forensics.
It was a rhetorically brilliant, highly effective piece of framing.
It really was. Baez stands in front of the jury and points out a glaring issue with Dr. Vass's methodology. He says, look, Dr. Vass refuses to share his proprietary database of chemical signatures with the defense so we can independently verify his work.
And he highlights the fact that this exact analytical technique has never been peer-reviewed for use in a criminal court in the United States.
It is totally experimental.
Totally.
Hey.
So Baez frames the prosecution not as seekers of truth, but as desperate lawyers using untested junk science to execute a young mother.
Which raises an incredibly important question about the psychology of modern juries, a phenomenon widely known as the CSI effect.
Yes, the CSI effect is so crucial here.
We live in an era where juries are deeply conditioned by television police procedurals. They watch shows where a hair is dropped into a sleek machine, it beeps 3 times, and a 100% positive identification pops up on a glowing screen.
They've been trained to expect absolute, undeniable scientific certainty.
Right. They want irrefutable DNA matches. They want pristine fingerprints. They want mathematics, not experimental biochemistry.
Let me take that a step further. When Baez successfully labels the state's star scientific witness as a practitioner of fantasy forensics, he doesn't just discredit Dr. Vass. He injects a massive dose of reasonable doubt into the entire physical investigation.
Because novel forensic science is a double-edged sword for a prosecution.
Exactly. If it works, it's a slam dunk. But in a high-stakes capital murder trial, if the defense can make the jury feel the science is even slightly shaky, the jury might discard the evidence entirely.
And the defense's strategy of dismantling the forensic evidence didn't stop at the odor analysis. They completely eviscerated the next piece of the puzzle, which was supposed to be the prosecution's definitive proof of premeditation.
This brings us to what I consider one of the most controversial and frankly terrifying digital forensics failures in modern trial history.
The computer searches. Because of Dr. Vass's explosive testimony regarding massive amounts of chloroform in the trunk, investigators naturally turned to the Anthony family desktop computer to see if anyone had been researching the chemical.
Makes sense.
They bring in a state software designer, an expert named John Dennis Bradley, to run a deep forensic analysis on the hard drive.
And during the trial, Bradley takes a stand and drops an absolute bombshell on the courtroom.
He does. He testifies that in March 2008, roughly 3 months before Caylee disappeared, someone utilizing that family computer searched for the terms chloroform, how to make chloroform, alcohol, neck breaking, and household weapons.
And here was the clincher that seemed to seal Casey's fate. He testified there were exactly 84 separate searches for the word chloroform.
84 searches. That number is staggering.
It implies deep, obsessive, calculated premeditation. It completely supports the prosecution's theory that this wasn't an accident or a moment of panic, but a first-degree, thoroughly planned murder.
But the truth, according to the digital forensic source material we have analyzing this event, is completely different.
So different.
And it all hinges on a specific, highly convoluted type of file structure called a MORC database.
Which is a nightmare to deal with.
Right. To understand how badly the state botched this, you have to understand the technology. The Anthony family was using the Mozilla Firefox web browser. Older versions of Firefox utilized a database format called MORC, which was originally developed by Netscape back in the 1990s.
Okay.
MORC was designed to save disk space by using a complex dictionary of aliases and mapped cells rather than straightforward readable data tables. Even the original software developers complained about how incredibly difficult it was to parse correctly without the native browser engine.
It is a plain text format, but it reads like absolute gibberish to a human. And it is notoriously prone to misalignment if parsed by third-party software.
Exactly the problem. The state's digital forensic expert, Bradley, used a proprietary software tool called Cashback to analyze this incredibly difficult MORC database.
And Cashback fundamentally misread the data structure.
It did. It looked at the history logs, and it did indeed find a single search query for the word chloroform.
One single search.
Yes. But because of how MORC stores alias IDs, the software conflated that single search query with the visitation counter for a completely different website record located in an adjacent data block.
So wait, the 84 visits were actually to the social media site MySpace?
Yes. The state's software literally combined a single Google search for chloroform with the fact that Casey had checked MySpace 84 times.
That is unbelievable.
There was only one search for chloroform occurring at exactly 15.1c.34 local time. The defense's own digital experts, utilizing a more refined software tool called net analysis, uncovered this massive discrepancy.
So when they confronted Bradley with the raw data, he realized his software had a catastrophic bug.
He actually admitted after the trial that the number 84 was entirely erroneous.
The impact of that error cannot be overstated.
Not at all.
The defense weaponizes this failure to argue that the state is either completely scientifically incompetent or worse, deliberately manufacturing evidence to secure a death penalty conviction.
Jose Baez looks at the jury and tells them that this flawed digital evidence has infected the entire prosecution's case like a cancer.
Wow. And then the defense adds another completely bizarre, deeply emotional twist to the chloroform narrative.
Cindy Anthony.
Right. Cindy Anthony, Casey's mother, the woman who originally called 911 and said the car smelled like a dead body, takes the witness stand for the defense.
And she testifies under oath that she was the one who made that single search for chloroform.
She tells the jury she was actually trying to look up the word chlorophyll because she was worried her dogs were eating bamboo in the backyard, but she misremembered the chemical name.
Which is just, I mean, the prosecution aggressively challenges this. They pull up her nursing hospital work records, which clearly showed she was physically at her office at the exact minute that search was executed on the home computer.
But Cindy just brushes the documentary evidence off. She claims she was a salaried manager, that she often left work early, and her timesheets simply weren't accurate.
She was willing to completely perjure herself and fall on her sword to protect her daughter from the death penalty.
It's tragic, really.
But here's the detail that absolutely haunts me. That single search for chloroform, the 84 search software glitch, Cindy's perjury. None of that was the biggest digital failure in this case.
No, it wasn't. There was another computer search, one that the jury never even heard about during the trial.
The missing Firefox search on the exact day Caylee vanished.
Yeah. Years after the trial concluded, a staggering detail emerged from the source material.
It turns out that when police investigators seized the Anthony family computer, they primarily analyzed the history for the Internet Explorer browser on June 16th, the day Caylee was last seen alive.
They completely neglected to run a full check on the Firefox browser history for that specific critical day.
And what did that hidden Firefox history log actually contain? It showed that at 2:51 p.m. on June 16th, someone using Casey's password-protected Windows account searched Google for the exact phrase, foolproof suffocation.
Foolproof suffocation.
Yes. They then clicked on an article criticizing pro-suicide websites, which explicitly discussed the mechanics of committing suicide by putting a plastic bag over one's head.
And after reading that article, the user immediately logged into MySpace, a site Casey used constantly, but her father, George, vehemently denied ever using.
A targeted search for foolproof suffocation. On the exact afternoon, a child disappears forever, followed by reading literature involving plastic bags.
And this evidence was entirely absent from the courtroom.
It was never presented. Because the initial police investigators missed it, the prosecution went to trial completely unaware it existed.
And it's a monumental failure.
I want you, the listener, to sit with that for a second. Think about your own digital footprint. Think about how terrifyingly fragile digital forensics can be.
It's scary.
On one hand, an experimental software tool can completely misrepresent your actions, turning a single, random internet search into a premeditated pattern of 84 searches for a deadly chemical.
And at the exact same time, basic human error by investigators can result in the most damning, definitive digital fingerprint imaginable being completely overlooked.
It illustrates a profound flaw in how we view technology in the courtroom. We treat computer logs as infallible, objective truth.
But those logs are parsed by flawed software written by fallible humans, and they are analyzed by overworked investigators who might simply forget to look in the right browser folder.
If the prosecution had been able to present a same-day search for foolproof suffocation, the entire trajectory of the trial and the jury's perception of premeditated malice might have shifted dramatically.
I agree completely. But without that definitive digital proof of premeditation, the prosecution's timeline remained fractured and circumstantial.
They were forced to pivot away from behavioral and digital theories and rely heavily on the horrific physical reality that came crashing down in December 2008.
The discovery of Caylee's remains.
Which fundamentally transitioned the case from a convoluted missing persons investigation into a definitive homicide trial.
Let's examine the anatomy of that discovery. December 11th, 2008. 6 months after Caylee was last seen.
A local utility meter reader named Roy Kronk is working his route in a wooded, swampy area just off Suburban Drive.
And this location is painfully close, just a short walk, really, from the Anthony family home.
Right. Kronk had actually called in tips to the police about this specific area months earlier in August, seeing something suspicious in the water, but responding deputies found nothing.
But this time, the water levels had receded. He calls again, and the police make a tragic, definitive discovery.
They find a tiny human skull. The skeletal remains are wrapped in a Winnie the Pooh blanket, stuffed inside multiple heavy-duty plastic garbage bags, and shoved into a Whitney-designed canvas laundry bag.
While the discovery provides closure to the search, it presents an immediate, massive hurdle for the prosecution.
Because of the condition of the remains.
Exactly. Because the remains had been exposed to the harsh, humid Florida environment, submerged in swamp water and subject to animal scavenging for 6 solid months, the chief medical examiner, Dr. Jan Garavaglia, could not determine an exact medical cause of death.
The official autopsy ruling was homicide by undetermined means.
And that ruling is the crux of the prosecution's struggle. If the medical examiner cannot tell a jury how someone died, how do you logically prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was a calculated first-degree murder?
The state realizes they have a massive gap in their narrative, so they focus entirely on one specific piece of physical evidence found adhering to the skull. 3 pieces of silver duct tape.
The duct tape immediately became the absolute focal point of the forensic battle over the physical remains.
So the state brings in a forensic anthropologist, Dr. Michael Warren. He attempts to show the jury exactly how the murder happened.
He presents a highly controversial computer animation.
Yeah, he superimposes a photograph of a living, smiling Caylee over an image of the decomposed skull, showing exactly where the duct tape was positioned when the body was found.
Dr. Warren testifies that the duct tape was placed over the nose and mouth prior to decomposition.
And his anatomical proof. The tape was physically holding the jawbone, the mandible, in place attached to the skull, despite the tissue rotting away.
He argues a simple logic. You don't put duct tape on a skeleton. You put it on a living child to intentionally suffocate them.
The prosecution attempts to push this narrative even further, introducing an incredibly bizarre, highly debated detail from an FBI latent fingerprint examiner named Elizabeth Fontaine.
Oh, the sticker.
Yes. She testifies that when she examined the duct tape in the laboratory under specialized lighting, she saw the faint, distinct outline of a heart-shaped sticker embedded on the adhesive side of the tape.
A heart-shaped sticker, which sounds incredibly sinister, deeply specific to a young mother, and practically screams premeditated cruelty.
But here is the critical failure. Fontaine testifies that by the time she set up the equipment to officially photograph this sticker outline, the chemical regions had altered the tape, and the outline had completely vanished.
She had absolutely no photographic proof it ever existed.
Which provides the defense with the perfect opening.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Baez is executing a classic death by a thousand cuts strategy.
Right. They understand they don't have to definitively prove Casey's innocence.
Exactly. They just have to show the jury that the prosecution's scientific evidence is flawed, subjective, and unreliable. To do that, they bring in their own heavy hitters.
They call Dr. Werner Spitz to the stand. He is an incredibly famous veteran forensic pathologist who has worked on some of the most high-profile assassinations in American history.
And he does not pull his punches.
No, he doesn't. He sits on the stand and boldly calls the state's official autopsy shoddy. He points out to the jury that the medical examiner didn't even bother to open Caylee's skull during the examination to check for internal trauma.
And regarding the prosecution's duct tape theory, Dr. Spitz aggressively argues it was placed there post-decomposition.
His reasoning was rooted entirely in forensic biology. He testified that if you place industrial duct tape firmly on the skin of a living, struggling person, the adhesive will trap epithelial cells.
Right, there would be residual DNA or skin cells permanently adhered to the tape, even after severe decomposition.
And he noted the state's own labs found absolutely no residual DNA on the tape.
Furthermore, Cindy Anthony returned to the stand and testified for the defense that the family routinely buried their deceased pets by wrapping them in blankets, placing them inside plastic garbage bags, and sealing the bags shut with duct tape.
Which offers the jury a perfectly innocent or at least non-murderous explanation for why the tape was there. It wasn't a murder weapon used to suffocate a child. It was simply used to seal a garbage bag during the disposal of the body.
And what about the phantom heart sticker the FBI agent saw?
The defense brings in a separate FBI document examiner who testifies they thoroughly analyzed the tape and found absolutely zero chemical or physical evidence of any sticker or sticker residue.
They systematically dismantled the prosecution's physical narrative piece by piece. They even turned the clothing found on the remains into a point of contention.
I want to highlight that because Jose Baez brings in another famous forensic scientist, Dr. Henry Lee, to examine the tiny jean shorts found on the skeletal remains.
Dr. Lee testifies that under microscopic examination, he found specific stress rips in the fabric of the shorts, suggesting they were forcefully pulled onto the body.
The defense uses this forensic detail to argue that the shorts were actually too small for Caylee, that she hadn't worn them in nearly a year.
The implication being, whoever dressed the body to dispose of it in the woods was doing it in a panic and didn't actually know Caylee's current clothing size.
The defense implies a mother would know her child's size.
Right, so by highlighting contradictions regarding the heart sticker, debating the biological placement of the duct tape, and questioning the clothing size, the defense successfully muddies the waters of the physical evidence.
The prosecution is asking the jury to believe a highly specific story. She premeditated this with chloroform, suffocated her daughter with duct tape, and threw her in a swamp.
And the defense is effectively countering. The chloroform searches are a confirmed computer glitch. The duct tape was to hold a garbage bag closed, and the medical examiner's autopsy was totally botched.
It sets the stage for what I consider one of the most jaw-dropping moments in legal television history. We've talked about how the defense chipped away at the state's evidence, but we have to talk about the radical story they told to replace it.
The opening statement.
Because Jose Baez's opening statement was a complete paradigm shift that no one, not the media, not the public, and certainly not the prosecution saw coming.
Everyone entering that courtroom expected the defense to lean into the lies Casey had already told. They expected Baez to argue Casey didn't do it, a kidnapper named Zanny actually took the child.
That was the established narrative.
But Baez stands up in front of the jury on day one and drops an absolute bomb. He states definitively, Caylee was not murdered. She was never kidnapped. On June 16th, Caylee Anthony accidentally drowned in the family swimming pool.
A tragic, devastating household accident. But Baez can't stop there. He has to explain why, if it was just a terrible accident, the body was wrapped in garbage bags and hidden in a swamp.
And why Casey partied at nightclubs for a month.
Right. This is where the narrative goes to an incredibly dark, shocking place. Baez claims that George Anthony, Casey's father, found Caylee drowned in the pool. He claims George panicked.
George, being a former cop, knew that if the police arrived, Casey could be charged with severe child neglect resulting in death.
So according to Baez, George took the body and disposed of it in the woods to cover up the accident and protect his daughter.
And as for Casey's bizarre, emotionless behavior over the next 31 days, Baez offered a psychological explanation. He alleged that Casey had been a victim of severe, lifelong sexual abuse at the hands of her father, George, and her brother, Lee.
It's horrific.
He argued that from a very young age, Casey was trained by this relentless trauma to hide her pain, to live in total denial, and to default to pathological lying whenever she was confronted with trouble.
She was, in his framing, psychologically paralyzed by her abuser taking control of the accident.
It's a staggering series of accusations. George Anthony took the witness stand and vehemently, tearfully denied ever abusing his daughter and denied having absolutely anything to do with Caylee's body.
But there's a detail in the source material, specifically from Jose Baez's own book, that is deeply unsettling. Baez writes about the moment he confronted George Anthony in a private hotel room with these sexual abuse allegations months before the trial began. Baez writes that George didn't react with the explosive outrage you would expect from an innocent father. He writes that George didn't deny it. He just sat there and wanted to know what more she had to say.
Which, if accurate, paints a deeply disturbing picture of the internal family dynamic and hints at why the defense felt confident utilizing such an extreme strategy.
Let me push back on this strategy, though, because this is where the legal mechanics confuse a lot of people. Baez makes these horrifying, reputation-destroying claims of sexual abuse and a body cover-up in his opening statement.
Yeah.
But during the actual trial, he produces absolutely zero proof. There are no medical records introduced, no psychological evaluations, no witnesses to the abuse, nothing.
He doesn't even prove that drowning happened. He just suggests it as a story.
Right. So how is a defense lawyer legally allowed to stand up in court, accuse a grandfather of sexual abuse and covering up a death, without actually providing evidence to prove it?
It comes down to the fundamental, non-negotiable bedrock of the American legal system, the burden of proof.
Okay, break that down.
The defense does not have to prove anything. It is explicitly not their job to prove that Caylee drowned or to prove the history of sexual abuse. The entire burden of proof rests entirely and solely on the shoulders of the state.
The prosecution has to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt.
Exactly. All the defense has to do is offer a reasonable hypothesis of innocence.
So because the medical examiner officially ruled the cause of death as undetermined, science cannot definitively say how the child died.
That is exactly the legal loophole they exploited. If accidental drowning is biologically just as possible as being suffocated by duct tape because the skeletal remains show no definitive signs of either, then reasonable doubt inherently exists.
Wow.
Baez didn't have to prove his story was the absolute truth. He just gave the jury a narrative that fit the physical evidence: a wet body, an undetermined cause of death, a clear history of severe family dysfunction, and legally challenged the prosecution to definitively disprove it.
And the prosecution simply couldn't disprove it. Which brings us to the culmination of the trial and a verdict that stunned the world.
After 6 grueling weeks of trial, over 400 pieces of evidence presented, and nearly 100 witnesses taking the stand, the jury is sent out to deliberate.
And the media pundits assume they will be sequestered for days, maybe weeks, agonizing over the details.
But they return in just over 10 hours. They deliberate for roughly a single workday.
And the verdict is read to a silent courtroom. Not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated child abuse, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter.
Caylee Anthony is found guilty only of 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement.
Essentially lying to the police about where she worked and the fake nanny.
The public reaction was explosive, demanding to know how a jury could let a murderer go free. But when you listen to the jurors who eventually spoke to the media, their reasoning was incredibly clinical.
They weren't endorsing Caylee Anthony.
No, not at all. They were following the jury instructions to the letter.
That highlights something crucial. Alternate juror Russell Huchler gave an interview where he stated plainly, the prosecution didn't provide the evidence that was there for any of the charges. It just wasn't there.
Juror number 3, Jennifer Ford, gave a deeply emotional interview where she said the jury was sick to their stomachs over the verdict.
She explicitly did not say they thought Caylee was innocent. She said, if you cannot prove what the crime was, you cannot determine what the punishment should be.
Which is a remarkably disciplined, almost agonizing application of the law.
It really is.
The jury foreman also pointed out that the motive provided by the state that Caylee wanted to live the bella vita, the beautiful life, was incredibly weak.
Right. The prosecution argued Caylee killed her daughter simply so she could go out to nightclubs.
And the foreman noted that a mother would want to do something like that to her child just because she wanted to go out and party. It was just kind of weak. It didn't make logical sense to them without hard evidence to back it up.
I want to build on that and return to the concept of the CSI effect we talked about. Did our cultural obsession with television forensics ultimately ruin this prosecution?
It's a huge factor.
Modern juries sit in a box expecting to be entertained and convinced by infallible science. They expect a DNA match on the duct tape. They expect a definitive cause of death from the coroner.
And when a case is built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, even overwhelming circumstantial evidence, like 31 days of lies and a car that unequivocally smells like a decomposing body, juries today are very hesitant to send someone to death row without that scientific absolute.
It certainly changed the landscape of the trial, but it also raises a massive question about the prosecution's strategic choices.
Yeah.
Did they blow the case by overcharging?
Yes, they swung for the ultimate penalty, death for first-degree murder.
But they fundamentally didn't know how Caylee died or exactly when she died. By swinging for the fences, did they force the jury's hand into an acquittal?
It's highly debated among legal scholars. If they had charged her with negligent homicide or felony murder, arguing that through her reckless actions or lack of actions her child died, they might have easily secured a conviction.
But by demanding a conviction for a calculated, premeditated murder without a cause of death, they set a bar for themselves that they simply couldn't clear.
Interestingly, Marcia Clark, the lead prosecutor in the O.J. Simpson trial, weighed in on this exact dilemma.
Oh, really?
Yeah. She noted that in Scotland, the legal system has a third verdict option. Not proven. You have guilty, and not proven.
That is so interesting.
And Clark argued that a not proven verdict might have fit this case perfectly. It allows a jury to say, we don't believe you are innocent, but the state utterly failed to meet its high burden of proof.
It satisfies the strict legal requirement without forcing the jury to legally declare a potentially guilty person innocent, which is what made the public so angry.
Exactly.
I think a vast majority of the people in that angry crowd outside the courthouse would have deeply preferred a not proven verdict, because the aftermath of this trial was a cultural earthquake.
The public fury was entirely unprecedented. It dominated cable news for months.
Nancy Grace essentially built a media empire on this case, calling Caylee "tot mom" every night and famously proclaiming the devil is dancing when the verdict was read.
But there was a fascinating sociological aspect to the outrage, a massive gender gap.
Polling showed that women were significantly more angry about the verdict than men.
Sociologists suggested it was because the core image of the trial, a mother partying while her child is rotting in a swamp, is a direct, visceral threat to the deepest ideals of motherhood and the maternal instinct.
It felt like a betrayal of the social contract.
And that profound anger translated into immediate reactive legislative action. We saw the rapid rise of Caylee's law petitions.
Millions of people signed online petitions pushing state legislatures to criminalize the failure of a parent to report a missing child within a certain time frame, usually 24 hours.
But even that well-intentioned movement had fallout. Critics correctly pointed out that these laws could lead to terrified parents making false reports just to avoid going to jail, wasting vital police resources when kids were just sleeping over at a friend's house without telling anyone.
There was also a massive wave of civil litigation aimed at punishing Caylee outside of criminal court. Texas EquiSearch, the nonprofit that spent over $100,000 searching the swamps for Caylee, sued Casey for fraud, arguing she knew the child was dead the entire time they were searching.
And Roy Kronk, the meter reader who found the body, sued her for defamation because Baez suggested during the trial that Kronk might have been involved in moving the body.
Even a woman actually named Zenaida Gonzalez sued her, claiming Casey ruined her life and employability by using her name for the fake kidnapping nanny.
Casey ended up filing for bankruptcy just to shield herself from all these liabilities, which brings us to the present day.
Fast forward to 2025 and 2026. Caylee Anthony has reemerged into the public eye. She recently started posting on TikTok, of all places, promoting a paid Substack newsletter.
For $10 a month or $100 a year, you can subscribe to her thoughts.
In these videos, she claims she's now a legal advocate. She says she's working for the LGBTQ community, for women's rights, and advocating for Caylee.
She also made a horrific new claim. She now states that her pregnancy with Caylee was the result of being drugged and raped at a house party when she was 18.
She is clearly attempting to completely rewrite her public narrative and monetize her infamy. But the ghosts of her trial are still swirling around her.
Dominic Casey, a private investigator who originally works for the defense team, filed sealed affidavits a few years ago.
In these sworn documents, he claimed that Jose Baez directly admitted to him that Casey killed Caylee, and further alleged that Baez and Casey had a sexual relationship to pay for her legal fees.
We must be explicitly clear here. Jose Baez vehemently denied both of those claims, calling them 100% false and defamatory.
And a judge ultimately sanctioned the private investigator over his actions and sealed the affidavits. But it just proves that the murky, toxic swamp of this case has never truly drained.
The speculation and accusations will never end. It remains a profound case study in how the justice system operates. For better or worse, when the lights are brightest and the science is flawed.
It really is. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. We want to thank you for joining us on this intense exploration of a case where subjective truth, a ravenous media spectacle, and fragile forensic science all collided in spectacular fashion.
It's a lot to process.
But before we go, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought. Think back to that missing Firefox internet search. The search for foolproof suffocation at 2:51 p.m. on the exact day Caylee vanished.
A search the police completely failed to investigate.
And the jury never got to hear about it. If the digital forensics had been handled properly from day one, would the jury have seen the definitive proof of premeditation they so desperately needed to secure a conviction?
Or, in the blinding glare of the media spotlight, had the prosecution already doomed their own case by pursuing the death penalty without ever knowing the true cause of death?
The diagnostic machine was broken here. There was no clean x-ray showing a broken bone, just murky, muddy waters. Keep questioning what you hear, look past the headlines, and until next time, thanks for taking the deep dive with us.